Well, free market capitalist economies might not be natural, but do they work? That's the question that we're going to address now in the third part of Module 4 on this thing called trickle down economics. Trickle down economics was more of a derogatory term actually applied to neoclassical economics theory by other economists who really questioned some of the central theories of free market economics, neoliberal policy that had come into play because of neoclassical economic assumptions. So let's look at this thing, trickle down economics. So let's look at what that is. Here's the definition, the neoclassical definition of this economic phenomenon. Lowering taxes on the wealthy, that takes money from the government, and it's presumed the government is inefficient because it doesn't have enough information about the market. And it gives that money to the wealthy. The wealthy are presumed to be efficient. They have more information about the market and they're more motivated to make money. So this gives money to wealthy investors who are supposed to be more efficient than government. What this will do is spur economic growth, and that'll eventually raise all incomes and reduce poverty. This is the trickle down assumption of neoclassical economics. And this graph kind of shows what it means. As the tax rate goes up, this is the bottom axis here, tax rate going up, GDP growth goes down. If you tax people more, your economy will grow less, and that's bad for everyone. So what you don't want to do is tax the rich. You want to remove taxes from everybody and the rich. This is sometimes called supply side economics. It's the same thing. So let's look at the history of taxation of the rich. This starts around the beginning of the 20th century. And you can see very low tax rates in the beginning. This is the classical liberal economic period in the beginning, the period that was spurred by the classical political economists, where the argument was keep taxes low. This jump in taxation around 1920, well, that's the First World War. This is United States data, by the way. That was the First World War, very expensive, needed a lot of taxes. But you remember, this is what Karl Polanyi called this one of the great horrors that was the result of this low tax classical liberal era. So this high taxation and war here is part of Polanyi's horrors of those fictitious commodities, the creation of market society, right? And you can see after that, well, that's the Great Depression, tax rates go low, but that's also part of those horrors that Polanyi was talking about. Tax rates go up in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Well, that's the Second World War. This is that kind of period of horrors that Polanyi was talking about. And he blamed these low tax rates partially on that, or not necessarily the low tax rates, but the sort of enslavement of humanity to this market economy thing, right? Then you have the post world period where tax rates were high. In the United States, the highest marginal tax rate was around 93%. Right now, it's kind of around 40% to give you a perspective on that. So, up in this time, taxes were very high, 93% on the highest marginal rate. This period is called the golden age of capitalism. Then slowly, the neoliberal, neoclassical economic theory takes hold in policy circles globally and is imposed in the world, like we discussed, and tax rates go down in the 1980s with that neoliberal, neoclassical policy and stay down around the 40% mark or less after that. So that's what taxation has happened. We're using the United States as an example again, general trajectory of taxation over the last 100 years or so. Let's see what happened with GDP growth in that time. Because remember, supply side economics, neoclassical economics, trickle down economics suggests when taxes are high, growth will be low. When taxes are low, growth will be high. So we've got economic growth in the United States in the red line. that's percentage change of GDP, and you have the highest marginal tax rate in blue. And you can see starting around 1940, after that war, there's your high tax rates. They're up there in the top graph as well, and you can see these are the same tax rates that start to be reduced in the neoliberal neoclassical period starting in the mid 1980s and continue reduced into the new millennium. So what happens to economic growth when as tax rates go down? If you look at this graph, you don't even have to look at it for very long, and you can tell economic growth was actually stronger when taxes were higher. Economic growth got much weaker as taxes were lowered. So in the big picture, it doesn't seem to correlate that reducing taxes for wealthy people makes the economy grow as it's supposed to. Let's look at distribution, because those tax rates, when they're reduced, are supposed to benefit poorer people, or at least average people. When those taxes are released, poorer people and average people are supposed to benefit. So in this United States data again, on this blue line, we have the bottom 90% income, average income of the bottom 90%, so the majority of the American population. And you can see it starts in 1950, and in that time it's going up and up and up until around 1980-ish. This gold line is the income of the top 1%, those who tend to own money, make money through investments, right? And you can see the top 1% gained income at about the same rate as everybody else did during that post-world period of high taxes up until 1980. After 1980, the incomes of the average people, the bottom 90%, really flattened. They really just didn't grow at all. That's with the reduction of those tax rates and the introduction of the neoclassical, neoliberal period. But look what happened to the income of the wealthiest. It went through the roof. So these tax breaks were supposed to trickle down and help everybody. They didn't seem to help anybody other than the wealthiest 1% here of the US population. And a lot of people point to that as evidence that trickle-down economics didn't work. You can look at the poverty rate too, because these tax cuts after the 1980s were supposed to help poverty. So what was poverty? The poverty rate around, it was high in 1959, but in that period of high taxation, it went down. Maybe that's expected. And it stayed about the same even after the 1980s. It went up a little bit with neoclassical economics and neoliberal policy being imposed. Then it went down a little. Maybe it stayed the same. Trickle-down economics meant that tax cuts did not help the poor. They didn't increase the income of the average person. All they seem to have done by these data is increase the income of the richest people and create much inequality in that country, the United States. People have tested these sort of theses in more formal ways. Here's a study, 2018, on inequality in economic growth, trickle-down effect revisited, and this is from the Development Policy Review. It can be clearly seen that the contribution of income transfer of poor to rich is more dominant than vice versa when taxes are cut on the rich. That is, poor people pay money up to wealthy people. Therefore, the invalidity of the trickle-down effect can be stated across 65 countries. A study that studied 65 countries over time found that trickle-down economy doesn't work, and that maybe money tends to trickle up from poor to rich when you cut taxes to wealthy people. Here's another one called The Relationship Between Economic Growth and Income Inequality from the International Journal of Economics and Financial Issues. And let's see, the main results show that economic growth and openness change constituted aggravating factors of inequalities, and that these effects are accentuated in the accelerated process of trade liberalization and in the country. Okay, cutting taxes made inequality problems in the country. Human capital and financial development might have helped to alleviate that when the government then invested in those things. But this is the important part. The second result shows that inequality had a negative impact on economic growth, and that this effect appeared more after the acceleration of the process of open exchange, cutting taxes and having free trade in this case. Um, so this result can be explained that the countries reach unbearable, quote, levels of inequality after tax rates and that tax cuts to the rich, and that tends to slow economic growth in the country. Let's look at this one. This is called Redistribution, Inequality, and Growth, New Evidence from the Journal of Economic Growth. Lower net inequality is robustly correlated with faster and more durable growth. So if you have a more equal country, you have higher growth. And this is across economies. Redistribution appears benign in terms of its impact on growth. So taxation of the wealthy and redistribution to the poorer segments or the average person doesn't lower economic growth. Inequality seems to affect growth through human capital accumulation and fertility channels. If you have an unequal society, people at the lower end don't get a chance to become educated as much. They get sick more. They don't have investment capital to start businesses, and this puts a drag on the society. So here's just some examples that we have of numerous examples of studies across economies that have found that trickle-down economics didn't work. I did a study myself with my colleague Dr. David Wozniak, and we had an idea about what if you could test this directly instead of using national income statistics. What if you found a town that was isolated enough that you could see a trickle-down economics project being implemented, and you could measure it on the town itself. And this is what we did. We found a town in rural-ish Honduras that was kind of isolated, and there was a project that was instituted with zero taxation of the government. So the government's not clawing back any money. And they said to foreign investors, come down, put all this money in. It was enough to double the size of the economy in a small town. So you've got a foreign company coming in, doubling the size of the economy in the small town, promising the locals all sorts of economic benefits from all this money coming into the town in the form of this large cruise ship port investment in this case. What we did is measured before and after this over a 6-year period, how this investment impacted the local people. And what we did, we found no evidence of improvement in the incomes or even employment of the local people, but we saw that it made it more difficult for them to pay for their needs and to pay for their food. So in this case, this trickle-down economics, untaxed large investment from wealthy investors, actually ended up making local life worse and didn't provide jobs and livelihood for the local population, even though it doubled the size of the local economy. So it didn't look very good for trickle-down economics based on that study. Let's look at an interesting example that you see. I saw this recently in a newspaper. This is Fortune magazine. Wall Street cheers bad news on jobs, sending stocks higher and betting that soft labor market will force Powell's hand in December. This is from the United States. Powell at this time was the chairman of the Fed, the agency that that regulates the money supply in the United States. Wall Street is cheering that jobs are lost. Wall Street, of course, in the United States is where the stock market exists. And wealthy investors tend to keep their money in the stock market, right? They have extra investment, extra money, and they put it into the stock market, hoping their money grows just through the market growing, not necessarily through work of their own, right? And when the central bank governor increases the money supply, that will unlock lower interest loans so these wealthy people can borrow more money against the money they already have. And this will inflate the stock market, make the stock market grow very fast. So when the economy is doing bad, the Fed wants to increase the money supply to inject growth and inject vigor into the economy. So the wealthy sort of stock investors are looking at this news of from the jobs report and seeing people losing their jobs, and they are cheering it, so to speak, because it's going to cause the stock market to increase. They cheer bad job and income news. Of course, average workers want jobs and want income. They're not getting a good deal here. So you've got one section of the population that's cheering the ill fortune of the other. This could be described as trickle up economics, right? Jobs are bad, people are losing their jobs, so the Fed increases the money supply, and this increases the growth in the stock market. The rich people are getting richer through their investments. If you notice here, there's also a fictitious commodity involved. And I didn't talk too much about this, but Polanyi's third fictitious commodity was money. He talked about it in another historical epoch, but you can see here this money thing that the Fed creates is actually creating great amounts of wealth, and it's being used to very much impact the amount of inequality in a society. Money seems to be really a thing that is wealth in itself. And Polanyi, when he talked about his third fictitious commodity, talked specifically that money is supposed to be a medium of exchange. It's not supposed to be this thing that creates masses of wealth. But this story suggests that people believe if the Fed creates more money, it's going to create more wealth. So, this is what you get. Again, this is a similar kind of picture that we saw in the last slide. You can see the S&P 500, the 500 biggest companies, how much they're worth on the stock market in the United States compared to average income in the United States. And you can see, starting in that neoclassical, neoliberal policy period, here again you see incomes sort of not growing at all for average people, but S&P 500 and grows a lot. So the trickle-down economic theory that was created, or that created the policies imposed in the 1980s, seems to have held average incomes steady, not increase the average income, while creating a massive amount of wealth for, in this case, the 500 wealthiest corporations and their investors in the United States.